Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and it's wonderful to be here with CALRG colleagues, and also to be here with two close colleagues from UCL as well. We're going to talk about a project that we began in the first weeks of lockdown. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a bit of background as to what we're going to talk about today. In the first weeks of lockdown, of course, when universities were going online, or campus universities were going online, here at UCL, we wondered how we can use our expertise as education researchers to try to support colleagues across the university. So Martin and I very quickly set up a project called Moving to Online Teaching and Homeworking. We were aware that it wasn't just about moving online, it was also about working from home. So I'm not going to say much about the methodology because this is going to come up during the talk today, but we did have an online questionnaire and we asked people to upload images that evoked how they felt about moving to online teaching and working from home. As I said, it's the early stages, so from March to July 2020, we received about 412 responses from across UCL, and we followed that up with 32 in-depth interviews. The main question that we were asking at the time was around how staff were experiencing that rapid transfer. And the reason was because initially we were sending back sort of fast analysis and reports to our senior people within UCL to think about how staff and indirectly how students could be supported during the lockdown. However, later we started thinking about some of the key themes that were coming from that data analysis, and one was the idea of teaching as caring and how the staff spent a lot of time and effort caring, not just about students, but about other things as well, about themselves and their families, about the whole idea of lockdown. So both Eileen and Martin have been taking forward this analysis, and that's what we're going to present to you today, and also ask you about your experiences of teaching as caring. So I'm going to pass over to Martin, who's going to tell you a little bit about the underpinning theories that we've been reading, the research work that's informed this analysis. So over to Martin.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with this it's kind of almost a genealogy of care theory, really. So we started off by thinking about just describing the data. We had all these transcripts, we had all the survey responses, and the first analyses of this were primarily descriptive and trying to do this sort of emergent categories work and drawing out from that things about the importance of boundaries, of maintaining time for personal work and all the rest of it. So that we'd already done, but what became apparent in there were that there were all these relational elements of it, all these elements which were linked to these ideas of care. So we came back and we chucked away all the codes that we generated and we started recoding everything in different ways. And the recoding drew on these theories of care that we'd been reading about and trying to work with in other contexts. So a lot of these ideas go back to work that Noddings developed and related to the idea to practices in education, which were really linked to the idea of mother-child relations, and it's trying to draw out from that the kind of relational elements of teaching, the importance of the affective elements of that, the interpersonal elements of that, and the knowledge of the other, orienting your practice towards the other. So it's really about a very attentive model of relating to other people, and Noddings was relating that to educational practice. There are a couple of other things since then. I think it's fair to say Eileen brought the Noddings element in most strongly. I was kind of interested in other care theorists. The care theorists that I was working with in other contexts were Joan Tronto's work. Now, Tronto, rather than sort of focusing on an individual relationship, was more interested in politics and society. So it's kind of a different focus, but with related ideas. So Tronto's ideas came in and we're talking about all the caring work that we do to maintain and repair the world. So it's moving out from an individual relationship to a society, a functioning society, and our place in it. And building on that tradition of work, some of the more recent care theorists have been looking at coming back to the sort of micro practices, the sort of situated everyday practices, but bringing back in the sense of materiality and sort of wider political influences on what people do in the moment. So all these references will be available in the slides. Alison and Eileen, I assume we'll be able to make the slides available to people after the talk, so people can look those up if you're interested. So those were the kind of ideas we were working with. Eileen, could you move to the next one, please? Thank you. And one of the things which was being drawn out of this was some of the politics which happen around these kind of caring relationships. So seeing things as a caring relationship is important because it draws to attention things that might otherwise be overlooked. But if we only focus on that, you can lose attention to some of the consequences of privileging that. So one of the things that Toronto draws out as being quite important is the idea that the feminisation of care is historically contingent. So Toronto's analysis goes back sort of 19th century Scotland, and looking at the way that care was seen as a very paternalistic characteristic. So it's very strongly linked to power, privilege, and having the resources to deploy to care for other people. So we're kind of cautious about naturalising the idea that this is a feminised practice. And from these sort of later theorists like Maria della Bellacasa, the idea that care is not just about the affective relationship, it's not just about the feelings of it, but it's also what she describes as a material vital doing and an ethico-political obligation. So it's something which is about transforming society in ways that may be better or worse, and in that transformation, bringing in things which are people and non-human actors, the material, the built environment, technologies, and so on. Okay, can we move to the next one, please? Thank you. So I've broken down here the 4 registers of care from Toronto's book because these we used to structure the analysis, the reanalysis, the recoding that we did of that data set. So Toronto's registers of care says that care is not a singular thing, but happens in different ways. So she differentiates between caring about things, so saying, I'm very concerned about global warming, for example. And this she describes in terms of an ethic of attentiveness. It says that there is something there that matters, things should be done about it. Taking care of moves beyond that to take responsibility for it. So, for example, as a manager, I would be responsible for the well-being of the staff that I manage. So that sense of being responsible for is not just being attentive to. It's not just that the staff may have needs, but it's up to me to do something about that. Caregiving then moves into the more relational practices of care work. So this is about directly meeting people's needs, and that was described in terms of an ethic of competence. So you might know that, for example, a student needs support, but are you actually able to give that support to them? And care receiving is about sort of closing the loop and generating feedback in this process. So acknowledging that objects of care are responsive, it's then about finding out were their needs met or even accurately identified in the first place. So this brings in this idea of the ethic of responsiveness. So what we did was we went through and we sort of identified in this data set things and people that were being cared about, and that included obviously students, but it included care for the self, care for family members, care for lab equipment, care for research projects, and then trying to break down were the kinds of things people were telling us about indications of caring about it, taking care of it and holding that responsibility, doing the embodied work of caregiving, or being responsive to the feedback that came from that in terms of care receiving. So the reason this became important, I'll move on to now. Eileen, if you could go to the next one, please. So we had this broad methodology. We've got the ethical approval, we surveyed people, we did the interviews, coding and the recoding, and importantly with the excerpts here we were talking about multiple codes being attached to the same thing, so it wasn't necessarily that they were singular. One of the reasons that's important, I wanted to draw it out, is that it drew attention to things that were tensions or conflicts within the data set. So excerpts that were coded as being at different registers or being about different things, we often flagged with a conflicts with kind of code so that we could acknowledge that there were things which were pulling people in 2 directions. Eileen, if you could go to the next one, please. Thank you. So the specific things we were looking for were again influenced by these theorists we were working with. So Toronto's ideal is that care is sort of integrated across these different levels. It's well accomplished and so on. And her argument is that disruptions in the process are useful to analyse. And this is why this idea of tagging for conflicts and tensions became important. These were moments of disruption so that we could look into, well, what's gone wrong? What does that signify? Where are pressures being brought to bear on people? Toronto's point, one example of this that's really important to attend to, often caregivers will find that their needs for care for themselves come into conflict with the care that they must give to others. So there are other theorists who have worked in this kind of area. Sarah Ahmed's stuff, I think, is quite interesting. This is a book she did called What's the Use of Use? But she talks about people being used up in the work that they do for others. So that sense in which you can give of yourself too much and burn out. So there's the importance of balancing the care that you provide to others with care for the self. And the other idea which Toronto brings in, which I really like, and once you've sort of seen it, it's quite hard not to see it in the data set, is the idea of privileged irresponsibility. So those who are relatively privileged are granted the opportunity to ignore certain forms of hardship that they do not face. And I suggest we call this privileged irresponsibility in her writing. So this was where we were looking for things where people were describing, actually, it's been fine for me. I don't see what the problem is. And that's because you're not personally experiencing the problem. You don't have that lived experience to draw on. So those were the kind of things that we were looking for in the data set, where we clustered the analysis around. So I'm going to give just some quick examples of that. Eileen, thank you. So in terms of disruptions, there were things which were established practices of care, which were failing because of this move online and people's lack of familiarity. So these might be disruptions, for example, to their sense of competence in terms of giving care to people. So this quote here, we've got program leaders who do a fabulous job face to face. The more important they are and the more status they have, the harder it is for them to deal with. It ends up sometimes with crossness. They're not used to feeling a bit of a newbie and at a loss, and suddenly they get their student intern explaining to them how to upload a document. So their competence of care had broken down, and someone else was then needing to do the care work for them and to their resources to repair that breakdown, to fix it again. So you can see how this is bringing in, it's explaining the situation by bringing in other actors and also thinking about these different kinds of care and how they're fitting together or failing to fit together. Thank you. On to the next one, please. Thanks. The conflicts, this image, which was on there earlier, but I'll just talk about it in a bit more detail. So these images came in and we got people to talk about them in the interviews, but this one is lovely and it gives us a lot of mileage. The idea of this person with 6 arms having to do 6 things simultaneously, including caring for children, taking part in a work meeting, cooking, clearing up, so care for the house, care for the household, care for the people in the house. Also this child at the front with the swirly eyes because they're spending too much time staring at the iPad, this sense of neglect of children, about not being able to care enough, to feeling guilty about that. So it's a really rich example which drew out a lot of these sort of sense of conflicts and being pulled in multiple directions at the same time. Thank you. Let's move to the next one. And the sense of privilege coming in. So there were people who thrived under these early stages of lockdown. So this quote was from a fairly senior male participant who said, essentially, I got a lot of things done, in particular in the first period of lockdown. When the clinical services were significantly reduced to a quarter of the activities, I wrote 15 book chapters for a textbook. Normally, I'd spend half a year on getting it done. On this weekend, 1 book chapter, that weekend. So I wrote a lot of them. And this sense in which people were freed from certain other responsibilities that had had before and could then spend time on things they wanted to do was really important and interesting because it showed how this was political. It wasn't evenly and fairly distributed. Some people really benefited from it, others didn't. I think we might have one more slide here. Let's move on. So yeah, this was one of these examples which drew out that sense of politics. So the gendered way in which some people benefited and others didn't. So this was a manager describing how his team was affected by this move online and saying, for my team, it's sort of sex-based. So all the men would rather work from home and the women would rather work from the office, which is a little bit surprising, I thought. And then they go on to reflect on this and realise why. They've got different home arrangements. One of them, for example, has sort of got a very small place. She also needs an ergonomic chair and an ergonomic mouse. So working from home has been a big strain. On the boys' side, 2 of them at least have got a dedicated space like a little office corner that they've been able to create. So it's much easier to keep it just in one place and keep it separate. So this was kind of illustrating the ways in which Patterns of care for children, for example, were typically gendered. Lots of children, even if both parents that were at home, would go to their mother. So mother's work was more disrupted than the father's work. But also in terms of the material resources available to them. A lot of the male participants described being able to recreate an office space, whereas the women were talking about trying to work on the kitchen table with the cooking and stuff in the background. So these things were not fairly or evenly distributed at quite a material level, and that had consequences in terms of the work they could do. So that's a sort of overview of the data set. I'm going to hand over to Eileen now, I think, for the more move to more focused in on teaching practices.
Thanks, Martin. So yeah, to return a bit then to the nodding stuff that Martin mentioned at the beginning, I think that it's quite interesting to think about how what we mean by teaching as caring, and then think about that in relation to technology. Clearly, these things are, there's an awful lot going on there, and Martin's just done, sketched a very interesting picture of all of the politics that are involved. But but we can think about caring as being maybe a positive thing in terms of how we teach, albeit balanced maybe, but with issues of power. But what Nodding's kind of suggested that characterised teaching as caring is teachers being engrossed in their students, like taking on board their perspective rather than seeing things from own personal frame of reference. That we have to step out of that and try and understand where students are coming from. And what was really what's important in some things that she says is that you have to listen to the students, be attentive to them, and listen out for their expressed needs rather than assuming what their needs are. So going making an effort to hear what they're saying, and then if they're not saying what you want them to say, sort of be prepared to have a discussion with them about that. But fundamentally, this is sort of trying to create relationships built on trust, respect, and reciprocity. In terms of teaching with technology during COVID and since, I think it's quite useful to think about how we could think of learning design as teaching as caring. What would that mean? So I mean, maybe some suggestions. Maybe it's like thinking about considering the students' feelings in terms of how we're designing learning, in the way people think about a whole child approach, maybe for teaching children, that we could with our adult students think of a whole human approach to teaching. So thinking about what people are bringing with them, maybe when they come to the learning environment. And so maybe some of these things like trying to create an inclusive learning environment by fostering that sense of security, maybe using technology to support communication and engagement rather than acquisition, it seems to be like, the first course that people do is thinking about delivering content rather than, finding ways to support engagement. And I think one of the things that was a very big deal during the pandemic is how to deal with this thing about students not engaging, and the debate around cameras on and off was central to that people wanted them on, students wanted to keep them off. But rather than just thinking, okay, that's not very good, but thinking about why that might be and maybe trying to design ways around it. So it's sort of like an approach to maybe to change learning designs in order to address the students' feelings and thinking about that as your rationale for doing it. So as examples of that, what I've just said, this thing about students not engaging sufficiently, and that being something that teachers cared very much about, and they cared for themselves and they cared for the students themselves. in relation to that. So for themselves, they were caring that they couldn't see what people were saying, you know, when they because they couldn't judge people's reactions. They couldn't see with the cameras off, you know, who's ready to speak, who's gazing out of the window, and they worried that the students found it stressful. But you know, clearly there was also a reason why lots of students would prefer to have their cameras off, and people have discussed that at length, you know, in terms of maybe they don't want their environment to be seen, maybe it's difficult for them, maybe, you know, the students are quite typically wanting to skulk at the back of the room, so, you know, why would they not want to do that online as well? But there's a reason why people prefer cameras off. Maybe it's less stressful. But, you know, there are ways, of course, using technology that we can get around that. We could, you know, sort of do more activities that involve clicking and pointing and moving things so that people can see what's going on without the students having to reveal themselves. And you know, so they can protect the self, they can engage in low risk activities. And that's where, you know, like quiz tools, survey tools in hybrid or blended online settings come in. And doing very, very simple things, you know, like annotating whiteboards or PowerPoint slides. I mean, I've got an example of that coming up because it's sort of a really, you know, a simple way that, you know, where you can actually see somebody's presence, but they don't have to reveal anything of themselves. And, you know, also using things like Padlets and so on to, you know, to add Post-it notes. So this is like an example of maybe using technology, you know, to care whilst also considering, you know, the feelings of the students. During lockdown, but quite early in lockdown, one of my colleagues at a different university was saying, oh, you know, I'm having this real problem with how do I get them to engage? And I said, well, why don't you use the, you know, sort of the whiteboard in Zoom, which at that point, you know, nobody was really doing very much of. I don't think people necessarily knew it was there. And and she created this quiz on PowerPoint, where students had to, it's a sort of theory quiz, they kind of have to link the concept with the explanation of the concept. And, you know, and what's really good about this kind of thing is that you know, you can draw a line, you can see it, so the teacher can see that they're doing something, and the students get to engage, but they don't need to reveal who they are, they don't need to sort of show their lack of knowledge necessarily. If they get it wrong, nobody knows who's got it wrong. And the thing is that the students absolutely loved this. They like went crazy for it, you know, in contrast to not having that opportunity to do it. So it seems like, you know, if we could do this thing, these simple things with learning design and understand why we're doing it, then it might work. And I suppose, like, you know, just we've got a book coming out, Diana Laurelard and I, where we're kind of thinking about, you know, what we mean by quality learning, and thinking, well, you know, often learning design doesn't explicitly reference feelings, emotions, but if you were going to do that, maybe what you would do is to sort of change that kind of standard learning design, which, you know, sort of begins with a lecture and then has a few, you know, sort of a little bit of Q&A discussion, maybe a bit of practice, maybe an assignment, to maybe think about, you know, putting a learning type prior to a lecture, or to support learners' emotions by, you know, keeping them attentive, engaged, questioning, and also therefore able to express their needs to the teacher. So having a discussion first about how people have already experienced the concept to attract their interest, or a problem that they can't easily solve to motivate them to find out more, or getting them to, you know, predict something to build a sense of excitement. I mean, obviously that's not like, you know, rocket science or out of keeping with what, you know, sort of probably good learning design is. But what we could kind of think about is that actually, if we rationalize it in terms of that teaching as caring, or learning design as teaching as caring, then you've got a different way of saying why it's important to people who may be, you know, providing you with the technology, or to explaining to other colleagues why you would do that. So Okay, so I'm going to lead on now to say, well, I've created a Padlet, and we gave a presentation at the Centre for Online Distance Education conference at University of London, where we didn't have a lot of time, but people started kind of adding to this Padlet. It was really examples that they had of teaching and caring, so that we can, using technology, so that maybe we could build up a resource to enable people to do this more effectively. And I wondered if you might like to add things to that Padlet, if you can. If you prefer to just give us some examples, I think we'll accept them however they go. If I can find the what's the name, the chat, I'll put the link to the Padlet there, so it'll be easy to go to. It can take a little while for my computer to respond to my command, I'm afraid, but it's taking longer, maybe because I'm showing the slides. It doesn't like it, it's very old. Here we are, got the little box now.
Well, you're doing that, Eileen. Agnes has just raised a very interesting point, which emphasises the fact that, during the time of this study, people were not just teaching online, but they were teaching from home. And so Agnes's point is, did our experience of video calls with family and friends influence what people might have expected in terms of video calls with students? And I don't think we can answer that from the data that we have, but it's an interesting point. Maybe Martin, do you want to say anything about, because of the different registers of caring that we analysed, is there anything that you noted that's related to Agnes's point?
Not neatly, I'm afraid. I mean, certainly there were people were really noticing where some of these sort of established patterns of caring were breaking down, and the sort of established relations with friends and families having to be distributed was a real source of disruption and problems for people. So they were very attentive to that. A lot of them talked about it as a sort of, in a sort of classic sort of remedial way, as, yeah, it's great, but it's not the same as. But in this kind of context specifically, they were talking about things like not being able to provide the embodied care that certain people needed. So there were specific reasons why that kind of distributed and mediated kind of communication wasn't the same as it wasn't equivalent. So I think they were kind of sensitized to some of the things that might happen and might not be happening in the online space educationally. Maybe it raised expectations. I don't think we really got enough data to be able to say anything really persuasive about that, though.
But I think it's an interesting point, because I mean, one of the things that really did characterize what happened during lockdown was that everyone, started using Zoom, and everything became like this video call thing, which, I mean, it's not as if that technology wasn't around prior to lockdown, and people could have used it to teach, but they didn't for some. Well, I mean, because it was so awkward often, like people couldn't join things, and it was sort of, and people weren't used to doing it. So I think that at least, at the very least, that sort of the idea that people just all of a sudden became familiar with using that technology and didn't immediately kind of get stressed by trying to join a Blackboard Collaborate call, must have made a huge difference, because it all did change. And now you can't, I don't think, I mean, most people expect to have synchronous video calls in online teaching now. Or I don't know whether you find that, but certainly here at UCL, there is that expectation.
So Eileen, what would you like people to do? Go on and maybe add some examples? Yeah,
I mean, we've got one of, if I maybe share this